Before your inner world crosses into a new chapter, there is often a quiet interval that almost nobody recognizes while they are inside it. It does not come with an announcement, and there is no calendar notification telling you that your life is about to feel different. Instead, you sense a weight in the atmosphere around you, an unusual stillness that resembles the pause before a storm reveals where it will land. And if you are hearing these words on August 10th, you may already know exactly what that feeling is. Perhaps it appeared during a disagreement that somehow ended before everything was said. Perhaps there is a call sitting unanswered, because something inside you no longer feels compelled to respond immediately. Perhaps the clearest evidence is even simpler. Someone provoked the part of you that once would have reacted instantly, yet this time you stopped, inhaled, and allowed the moment to pass through you. You may have interpreted that change as fatigue. You may have wondered whether you have become emotionally disconnected. You may even have caught yourself thinking that something about you has felt unfamiliar lately. But consider another possibility. Maybe you are not falling apart at all. Maybe you have reached a final test, one that does not measure knowledge through written questions but reveals your growth through restrained patience, and those private seconds when an older version of you would have erupted, chased an explanation, or demanded resolution while the person you are becoming chooses differently. Many people understand this period of the year as an emotional crossing point, a symbolic place where everything you have endured quietly seems to return for one final examination before those experiences can become integrated into who you now are. This is not about imagining that the universe is sitting somewhere assigning you a score. The deeper truth is that you have been evaluating yourself, often without consciously knowing it. And that brings us to the question I want you to carry with you throughout the next 25 minutes. What if the struggle that feels most difficult right now is not simply working against you? What if it is serving a purpose in your transformation? Before we finish, we will move through 5 emotional signals that can reveal just how far you have already traveled. Recognizing even one of these within yourself may show you that your progress is much greater than you have allowed yourself to believe. And the 5th signal is especially important because it is the one people most often interpret incorrectly. Once its meaning becomes clear, the way you understand your own difficult experiences may change permanently. So begin here. Real growth rarely enters your life looking impressive. It does not arrive decorated with certainty or confidence. More often, it hides inside irritation, uneasiness, and the unsettling realization that circumstances you once accepted without resistance have suddenly become almost impossible to tolerate. Conversations that once seemed harmless begin to drain you. Noise that used to blend into the background now feels intrusive. Even ordinary social exchanges can begin to feel empty, as though your mind is searching for something deeper and can no longer pretend that surface-level connection is enough. This is one of the most confusing parts of becoming emotionally stronger. While the transformation is actually taking place, strength may be the last thing you feel. You may experience grief instead. You may feel disoriented. You may wonder why your familiar ways of coping no longer work. That confusion can convince you that something inside you has gone wrong, when what may actually be happening is that the identity you once depended on is losing its purpose. There was a version of you that survived by making yourself smaller, by swallowing reactions, by maintaining harmony even when doing so required abandoning your own emotional truth. That version knew how to function in environments you had learned to endure. But now that identity may be fading quietly, without waiting for your conscious approval, because you no longer need every strategy that once protected you. This is why a day such as August 10th can be treated symbolically as an internal boundary. It becomes an opportunity to look honestly at what you have continued carrying and ask whether you are finally prepared to release it. The date itself does not need to possess mysterious control over your destiny for the moment to matter. Human beings naturally use markers to understand change. Sometimes we need an invisible boundary between the person who endured yesterday and the person who decides how tomorrow will be lived. We need a moment when we can recognize that everything before it belonged to survival, while everything after it can begin with a different choice. Yet there is something crucial that people often misunderstand about this final test. It usually does not arrive as a spectacular crisis. It does not necessarily appear through an accident, legal trouble, or frightening medical news. More commonly, it enters through ordinary situations that seem almost too small to matter. It might be one cutting remark from someone in your family. It might be the absence of a message from a person who once always contacted you first. It might be a familiar disappointment that previously would have consumed your thoughts for 3 entire days. The difference is that now you notice the pain when it arrives. You do not deny it. You allow yourself to feel what it touches inside you. But instead of building a temporary home inside that hurt, you discover that by dinner, you have already begun releasing it. That is where the real examination is happening. The measure of your growth is not whether difficult experiences disappear from your life, because difficult experiences will continue to exist. What matters is whether those experiences can still control your emotional world with the same force they once possessed. And this is where the 5 signs begin to reveal themselves. They are not necessarily dramatic enough for other people to notice. They can be subtle, private changes in the way you respond, think, and recover. Yet when you recognize them, they can show you that your internal landscape has already shifted far more than you realize. The first sign may already be unfolding in your life today, even if you have never given it a name. Think about the person you once were during conflict. Perhaps disagreement immediately became something you had to win. Every conversation felt as though evidence needed to be presented, and a verdict had to be reached. You were simultaneously defending yourself and constructing an argument, searching desperately for the words that would finally make the other person understand what you meant. You needed them to acknowledge your perspective. You needed them to recognize why you were hurt. And when they refused, the conversation did not truly end when both of you stopped speaking. It followed you into the night. At 2 in the morning, your mind could still be replaying every sentence, rearranging your responses, discovering the perfect comeback long after there was nobody there to hear it. 3 days later, you might still be continuing the disagreement privately while standing beneath the shower, finally winning a conversation that had already ended everywhere except inside your own head. Picture Elena. For years, whenever her sister spoke to her with a cutting or dismissive tone, Elena experienced the reaction almost physically. Her entire body seemed to switch into defense. She would explain herself immediately. She would argue her position. If the exchange ended without the resolution she wanted, she might send another message around midnight, because leaving the conversation unfinished felt unbearable. It was not simply about proving a point. Somewhere beneath her need to respond was a deeper emotional demand. She needed the interaction to make sense before she could feel settled again. She needed acknowledgement before her nervous system could relax. Then came an ordinary Tuesday. Nothing about the day suggested that a major internal change was about to reveal itself. Her sister spoke to her with the same familiar sharpness, carrying the same dismissive edge that had triggered Elena countless times before. The situation looked almost identical from the outside. But what happened inside Elena was no longer the same, and that difference is where the next part begins. The most surprising evidence of transformation can appear in the exact situation that once had complete access to your emotions, and that is what happened to Elena. The familiar heat began moving through her almost immediately, the same internal surge that had pushed her into countless arguments with her sister before. Yet this time, another sensation arrived before that fire could take control. It was calm, unfamiliar enough that she almost did not trust it. Somewhere inside that pause, Elena realized that this disagreement did not have to become another battle she needed to win. Her sister did not have to accept her perspective. She did not have to keep explaining herself until the other person finally understood. So instead of reaching for another defense, Elena acknowledged what had been said with a simple response, telling her sister that she heard her, and then she allowed the exchange to finish. What happened afterward was almost more unsettling than the conversation itself. For the next hour, Elena remained aware of the quiet inside her, studying it as though she were waiting for the old reaction to return. She wondered why the interaction had not consumed her the way it once would have. The answer was not that she had become incapable of being hurt. Her sister's words could still sting. The difference was that Elena no longer required those words to be corrected before she could return to herself. She no longer needed to convince another person that their judgment was inaccurate in order to preserve her own emotional balance. That is the first shift. It is the distance between an automatic reaction and a conscious response. A reaction happens before reflection has time to enter the room. It is immediate and instinctive, driven by a nervous system attempting to defend the part of you that remembers being wounded in similar ways. A response moves differently. It gives itself time. It carries less noise. It emerges from the part of you that has lived through enough disappointment to understand that meeting every flame with another flame only creates a larger fire. And if you've experienced something similar recently, this distinction may explain why your own behavior has begun surprising you. There is enormous strength in silence when silence is freely chosen rather than created by fear. Choosing not to continue a conflict does not automatically mean that you have stopped caring. Sometimes it means you have finally understood that every conversation does not deserve the authority to disturb your peace. Perhaps situations that once made you explode now find you strangely composed. Do not automatically interpret that as losing your ability to speak for yourself. It may be evidence that you have developed enough trust in yourself to know that your truth does not become more valid simply because you deliver it more loudly. Yet this is only the first sign, because another transformation tends to follow, and it can be so subtle that the people surrounding you recognize it before you understand what is happening yourself. One of the least discussed realities of personal growth is that expansion does not always feel like receiving more. Sometimes growth first introduces itself through a strange disappearance of desire. People you once rushed to see no longer pull you toward them in the same way. Familiar habits begin feeling empty. Environments that once gave you a sense of belonging suddenly feel like places you have already emotionally left. That experience can be frightening because you may have expected becoming stronger to feel energizing and triumphant. Instead, there can be sadness attached to it. You may find yourself declining gatherings that once seemed impossible to miss. A group conversation that previously entertained you may now feel like endless background noise. A friendship whose main connection has always been repeating the same complaints and revisiting the same unresolved problems year after year can suddenly feel emotionally expensive. When that happens, you may wonder whether you have become cold, distant, or difficult. But what may actually be changing is your willingness to demonstrate loyalty by repeatedly sacrificing your own peace. Imagine carrying the same coat through 15 years of your life. There was once a time when it fit your body perfectly. It protected you. It gave you warmth when you needed warmth. But 15 years passed, and while the coat remained essentially the same, you did not. Your body changed, your circumstances changed, and the person looking back from the mirror became someone different. Eventually, wearing that coat simply because it once served you would make no sense. Relationships, routines, social environments, and even your definition of enjoyment can become like that coat. Something can have been right for an earlier version of you without remaining right forever. And releasing it does not require destroying it. You do not have to turn gratitude into resentment. You do not need to erase the memories or convince yourself that every year you spent there was a mistake. You can recognize what something gave you, appreciate the role it played, and still understand that carrying it forward is no longer necessary. This is where boundaries begin to take on a deeper meaning. They are not necessarily barriers designed to keep everyone outside. At their healthiest, they become an expression of respect for your own limited emotional resources. Establishing a boundary is not automatically an act of punishment toward another person. It can simply be an internal recognition that your energy has limits, and that you have finally begun treating those limits as valuable. And this realization can awaken guilt, sometimes intensely. The moment you begin protecting your emotional space, an older part of you may accuse you of selfishness. That guilt makes sense when you consider how long many people have been taught to measure goodness through constant availability. If you spent years believing that being kind meant giving access to yourself regardless of the personal cost, then choosing yourself can initially feel like doing something wrong. Yet growing beyond a relationship, habit, or environment is not identical to betraying it. Distance does not automatically erase love. You can care deeply about someone while accepting that closeness with them is no longer healthy for your peace. You can remember a chapter of your life with tenderness without deciding that you must continue living inside that chapter forever. So notice what has recently begun draining you. Pay attention when experiences that once felt effortless now leave you depleted. That exhaustion does not necessarily mean that you are becoming less capable. It may be the first time you are genuinely listening to an inner signal that you previously ignored. And once you begin listening, another test emerges, one that can be considerably harder because it asks you to surrender a desire almost everyone carries somewhere inside themselves. It asks whether you can release the need for vindication. Deep within many people's lives, an imagined scene in which everything finally becomes clear. The person responsible for hurting you eventually recognizes the damage they caused. They understand your side. They return with the apology you waited for. Perhaps life itself seems to correct the imbalance, delivering consequences on your behalf and somehow confirming everything you wished you could have made them understand. Wanting that moment does not make you weak or cruel. It is an intensely human desire, especially when part of your pain came from feeling unseen or misunderstood. But another profound turning point occurs when your ability to continue living no longer depends on that imagined scene becoming reality. Something changes when you realize that the person who hurt you may never fully understand what they did. The apology may never arrive, and the validation you once waited for may remain absent. Yet your life does not have to remain emotionally suspended while you wait. And that is where the next sign begins. Imagine Daniel for a moment, because what happened inside him may feel uncomfortably familiar if you have ever waited for someone who hurt you to finally understand the damage they caused. For 2 years after his business partner betrayed him, Daniel carried an invisible courtroom everywhere he went. His former partner had taken clients with him, damaged Daniel's credibility, and somehow managed to reshape the story so that events appeared to favor his version of what happened. Daniel kept imagining the day when the truth would finally surface. In his mind, there would eventually be a reckoning, a moment when everything would become undeniable and the apology he believed he deserved would finally arrive. But that day never came. There was no dramatic confession, no satisfying correction of the story, and for a long time, the absence of justice felt almost as painful as the original betrayal. Daniel interpreted the silence as evidence that the score had simply been left unsettled. Then, little by little, something inside him began changing. The realization did not arrive dramatically. It emerged slowly enough that at first he barely noticed it. Daniel discovered that he was no longer truly waiting for his former partner to say he was sorry. What he had actually been waiting for was permission to stop carrying the experience, and the person refusing to grant that permission had been Daniel himself. When he eventually forgave, he did not do it because the betrayal had somehow become acceptable. It had not. The behavior was still wrong, and forgiveness did not rewrite that reality. Daniel released it because maintaining his grip on the injury had eventually become more painful than opening his hand. This distinction matters because letting something go is often misunderstood. Releasing an experience does not require pretending that it never occurred. It does not transform harmful behavior into acceptable behavior, and nobody else gets to decide when forgiveness should happen for you or whether it should happen at all. There are wounds for which distance may be the only necessary response. Forgiveness is not mandatory, and distance can be equally valid. Yet when release does become possible, you may notice an unexpected feeling. Walking away without the confrontation you once imagined does not necessarily make you feel defeated. Sometimes it makes you feel physically and emotionally lighter. That is because genuine emotional strength often has very little interest in making a spectacle of itself. It does not require an audience. It does not need the person who wounded you standing nearby to witness your victory. Somewhere in that realization, another powerful truth begins to emerge. There may come a point when protecting your peace matters more than convincing another person to understand your perspective. You stop waiting for them to finally see what you saw. You stop requiring their agreement before taking your next step. Eventually, all you need is enough trust in yourself to place one foot ahead of the other and continue moving. So if you have ever released resentment and discovered relief where you expected guilt, do not mistake that experience for weakness. It may have been the moment you grew beyond the belief that revenge was necessary for closure. And before we move into the fourth sign, the one that begins changing the way you approach decisions from this point forward, I want you to recognize what may already be happening inside you. If any of these signs have felt familiar, write this in the comments. I choose the stronger version of me. Writing those words does not magically rearrange your circumstances, but giving language to an internal change can make something private feel concrete. When you name what you are choosing where other people can witness it, the shift stops existing only as an unspoken feeling and begins becoming a commitment you can recognize. So if those words describe where you are right now, allow yourself to say them. Allow the choice to be seen. Now we arrive at sign number 4, and this matters because it influences whether the changes you have already made can actually remain part of your life. Most of us spend years learning to search outside ourselves for confirmation before trusting what we already feel inside. We wonder whether we handled something correctly. We look for approval. We question whether our decisions would make sense to our parents, our friends, our co-workers, or the invisible social audience we imagine observing our lives, even when nobody is actually paying attention. That repeated search for reassurance takes more than time from you. It gradually erodes certainty. Every time you hand the question of what is right for your life to somebody else's opinion, you weaken your relationship with the very judgment that is supposed to guide you, your own. Consider Priya. For 3 years, she remained in a stable job that was crushing something essential inside her. Everyone around her described the position as an excellent opportunity, and their approval became part of the cage that kept her there. Priya was not primarily frightened of being unemployed. What frightened her was the possibility of disappointing people who would never have to wake up and live the life she was living. Her turning point was not a dramatic scene where she suddenly became fearless and walked away without hesitation. It was much quieter. One day she stopped asking herself how other people might react and replaced that question with another one. She asked herself what she already knew beneath all the outside voices was right for her. The answer frightened her. Following it disappointed some people. Yet when she finally honored what she knew, she felt something settle inside her chest that had been missing for years. That sensation is what self-trust can actually feel like. It is not constant confidence, and it does not mean knowing exactly how everything will turn out. Self-trust is the quieter belief that whatever follows your decision, you will be capable of meeting it because you finally consider your own judgment worthy of being heard. Once that begins, you can see it appearing across every area of life. In relationships, you no longer require another person to certify that the boundary you established was reasonable. In your career, You become less dependent on a job title or paycheck to prove that a choice was correct. Even ordinary decisions begin changing because you no longer feel compelled to collect 10 different opinions about something whose consequences will ultimately belong to you alone. But there is another layer to this sign that is easy to overlook. Self-trust is not primarily created when your choices lead to perfect outcomes. Its deepest foundation is often built after a decision goes badly and you refuse to turn against yourself because of it. You choose, the result disappoints you. Perhaps you even realize that you would do something differently next time, yet instead of abandoning yourself through shame, you remain on your own side. That is where trust becomes real. It is not earned because everything worked exactly as planned. It is earned because when things did not work, you still remained loyal to yourself. So if you have recently noticed that you need fewer outside opinions before making decisions that concern your own life, do not automatically label that as arrogance. It may simply mean that your own voice has finally become strong enough to rise above the surrounding noise. And now we reach the fifth and final sign. Stay close to this one because it can completely rearrange the meaning you have assigned to your recent struggles, especially the experiences you interpreted as setbacks and the moments that seemed to prove nothing was unfolding the way you hoped. This final sign is the one people most frequently misunderstand. Many of us secretly imagine healing as a future moment of vindication. We picture the people who underestimated us, abandoned us, or doubted our potential, eventually seeing what our lives became. Perhaps it is a promotion. Perhaps it is a relationship. Perhaps it is simply building a life so fulfilling that the old chapter begins looking like their mistake rather than something you barely survived. Wanting that moment is deeply human. When pain has gone unseen, part of you naturally wants somebody to witness what it cost you. Yet genuine transformation carries a quieter truth, and sometimes it is uncomfortable to accept. Becoming stronger can eventually mean no longer requiring that moment at all. Strength does not always arrive as revenge. It does not necessarily appear through recognition, financial success, or the apology you waited years to receive. Sometimes it arrives on an entirely ordinary morning when you wake up and suddenly recognize that you no longer require your former life, the people who occupied it, or the story they once told about you to confirm the reality of who you have become. Your former partner does not need to discover what they lost. Your previous boss does not have to witness your success. The people who underestimated you do not have to publicly admit that they were wrong in the dramatic way you may once have imagined when the wound was still fresh. Something extraordinary happens when those outcomes stop being requirements. You stop placing your peace into the hands of people who are not even present in your life anymore. That is emotional detachment in its healthiest expression. It is not becoming cold. It is not pretending you never cared. It is freedom from the demand that your past must approve of your present before you are allowed to enjoy it. And this is precisely why the experience can resemble a final test. Until this stage, there may still have been a quiet part of you waiting somewhere in the background, waiting to be recognized, waiting for confirmation that you were right, waiting for the story to conclude in the way you believed fairness demanded. But the test was never whether that scene would eventually arrive. The deeper question was whether you could continue walking with your whole heart and with genuine peace, even if it never did. Now look back at the path we have traveled together. You began responding differently to conflict. Instead of needing victory in every disagreement, you started losing your attachment to environments, habits, and relationships that continually depleted you. You discovered that revenge was not required for release. You began giving your own judgment more authority than the opinions surrounding you. And now you are reaching the final layer, learning that the life you are creating does not need validation from the people or circumstances belonging to the life you have already outgrown. These 5 signs are not isolated transformations. They are different layers of one larger internal movement, each quietly preparing the ground for the next. If you recognize several of them beginning to appear in your own life, even imperfectly, even inconsistently, you may be witnessing the early stages of becoming the person you always possessed the capacity to become. And this returns us to August 10th. That date does not control your destiny, and no square on a calendar possesses authority over the direction of your life. Yet symbolically, August 10th can still serve another purpose. It can become a checkpoint where you stop long enough to examine the previous several months honestly and ask yourself what you have survived, and more importantly, who surviving it has caused you to become. When you are still inside difficult experiences, it is remarkably easy to overlook transformation because genuine change rarely announces its arrival. There are usually no fireworks. Instead, it appears through small choices that seem almost insignificant while you are making them. It is the moment you remain quiet where you once would have exploded. It is the boundary you finally establish without immediately apologizing for having one. It is the resentment you release, not because your memory disappeared, but because freedom became more important than continuing to carry the wound. It is the decision you make because something inside you knows it is right for your life, even when that decision does not appear right to everybody watching from outside it. So if the previous several months have felt like an examination, there is a sense in which they have been exactly that. But not an examination imposed by the universe, not a punishment, and not a curse. It has been an encounter between the person you are becoming and the person you once needed to be. Again and again, that emerging version of you has been asking whether you are finally prepared to allow it to lead. And if you are still here, still listening, still standing, after everything that has attempted to break you this year, perhaps some part of you already knows the answer. Before you leave, hold one final question in your mind. Of these 5 signs, which one feels closest to your life right now? Is it the realization that you no longer respond to conflict the way you once did? Is it the discovery that certain people, environments, and patterns no longer possess the same attraction? Is it your growing ability to leave something behind without requiring revenge? Is it the increasing trust you place in your own voice? Or is it the final realization that your old life no longer needs to prove that you were right before you can fully inhabit the life you are building now? You do not need to answer that question for anybody else. Sit with it privately and notice which truth keeps returning. Because becoming stronger rarely feels powerful while the transformation is occurring. From the inside, it can resemble confusion. It can resemble grief. It can feel like exhaustion that you mistakenly interpret as weakness. Then eventually, there comes a day, perhaps even today, when you look backward and understand that what you called a test was never merely something happening against you. It was revealing the person you had already begun becoming. If these words reached you at exactly the moment you needed them, allow that recognition to become another reason to continue. Like this video if it gave language to something you have been carrying quietly. Subscribe if you want more reflections like this, and I will meet you in the next chapter. Because your story is not ending here. This is simply the chapter where you stop exhausting yourself trying to become somebody else and finally begin recognizing the person who was already there beneath everything you had learned to carry.